There is a version of your life running somewhere in the back of your mind right now, fully formed, waiting for permission. You have never actually granted it. The business you'd start, the conversation you'd finally have, the person you'd become if conditions were just slightly different than they currently are. And the strange, quietly devastating truth is that you have been rehearsing that life for years, sometimes decades, without ever stepping into it. Because some part of you has convinced you that now simply isn't the right time. It never is. That's not a coincidence. That's the mechanism. Because the right moment you're waiting for was never a real thing you were searching for out there in the world. It was something your mind manufactured quietly and convincingly to protect you from a risk it was never designed to tolerate. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why your brain builds that illusion, how it convinces you it's being rational, and what it actually costs you every single time you believe it. Picture the moment right before you were about to do something that mattered. Not something trivial, something that actually carried weight. Sending an application, ending something that needed to end, starting something you'd wanted for years. Try to remember what happened in your mind in the seconds before you backed away. Chances are, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like reason. A perfectly logical thought arrived, almost politely, suggesting that now wasn't quite ideal, that a little more preparation, a little more certainty, a little more time would make the decision safer. And you believed it, because it sounded so reasonable. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because what felt like careful judgment was very often something else entirely, a highly sophisticated form of avoidance, dressed up so convincingly as wisdom that you never thought to question it. Most people believe procrastination and hesitation are problems of discipline, a simple failure of willpower that better habits or more motivation would eventually fix. But that isn't the real problem. And treating it as one is exactly why so many people spend years cycling through productivity systems, motivational content, and New Year resolutions that dissolve by February, without ever touching what's actually happening underneath. What's actually happening is that your nervous system has classified the action you're avoiding as a threat, and it is doing exactly what nervous systems are built to do when they detect danger. It is protecting you from it. Neuroscience offers a precise explanation for why this feels so convincing. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, doesn't distinguish particularly well between physical danger and psychological danger. A public failure, a rejection, an uncertain outcome that could damage your sense of identity. All of these can trigger a stress response nearly identical to the one that would fire if you were facing actual physical harm. And when that response activates, it doesn't just create fear. It hijacks the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for long-term reasoning and deliberate action, and replaces it with short-term, threat-avoidant thinking. This is why, in the moment you most need clarity, you instead feel a fog of justifications arriving from nowhere, each one sounding perfectly sensible, each one quietly designed to keep you exactly where you already are. This is the part almost no one notices. Because the mind doesn't announce itself as afraid. It announces itself as prudent. It says, "This isn't the right time." It says, "You should wait until you're more prepared." It says, "What if you're not ready yet?" And every one of those sentences feels like wisdom, because fear, when it's sophisticated enough, never identifies itself honestly. It borrows the language of good judgment to keep you compliant. But even this isn't the deepest layer of what's happening. Something even more dangerous is unfolding beneath the fear itself. And it lives in a place most people never think to look. Alfred Adler's work on the concept of safeguarding tendencies offers a devastating explanation for why waiting can feel almost comfortable, even as it quietly ruins a life. Adler observed that many people unconsciously construct obstacles, delays, and conditions, not despite wanting to succeed, but specifically because those obstacles protect them from ever having to test their actual capability against reality. As long as the right moment hasn't arrived yet, failure remains hypothetical. The moment you actually act, real consequences enter the picture. Consequences your self-image now has to survive. Waiting, in this light, isn't the absence of ambition. It's a strategy, an unconscious one, that allows a person to preserve the fantasy of who they could become without ever risking the identity collapse of discovering who they actually are when they try. This is why so many people feel a strange, almost addictive comfort in endless preparation, researching, planning, reading one more book, taking one more course, refining a plan that never quite reaches execution. It isn't laziness. It is often the opposite, an enormous amount of effort, meticulously redirected away from the one action that would actually create risk. This is where the pattern deepens into something genuinely unsettling. Because the cost of the strategy isn't just delay, it's identity erosion, slow and largely invisible, happening in the background of a life that, from the outside, might look perfectly fine. Carl Jung's concept of the self, the deep, unifying core of who a person is meant to become, offers a crucial insight here. Jung believed that psychological health depends on movement toward individuation, the ongoing process of becoming fully who you actually are, rather than remaining frozen in a version of yourself shaped entirely by fear and external expectation. When someone spends years waiting for the right moment, they are not simply delaying an action. They are delaying their own development, keeping the self suspended in a kind of psychological holding pattern, unable to mature because maturity requires confrontation with real experience. And real experience is exactly what waiting is designed to avoid. This has a cost that most people can feel long before they can name it. A quiet, persistent sense of being somehow behind their own life. Watching years accumulate while the version of themselves they imagined becoming stays permanently just out of reach. That feeling isn't sadness in the ordinary sense. It's closer to what Jung might have called a failure of individuation, a self that never got the chance to become itself. because it was too busy waiting for conditions that were never actually the obstacle in the first place. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath even this, and it involves a cognitive distortion, so common that almost everyone has fallen for it without realizing it. Behavioral economists call it the planning fallacy, but its emotional cousin runs even deeper. A bias psychologists sometimes describe as the arrival fallacy, the deeply held, almost universal belief that once certain conditions are met, once you have more money, more confidence, more clarity, more time, everything will finally feel different enough to act. But research on this exact belief reveals something quietly devastating. The conditions people wait for rarely produce the readiness they expect, because readiness was never actually an external circumstance to be achieved. It is a felt experience generated internally, and internal experiences don't wait patiently for external permission. They have to be practiced into existence through action, not summoned by circumstance. This means the confidence you're waiting to feel before you act will very often never arrive before the action itself. It arrives after, sometimes immediately after, as a direct consequence of having acted at all. Which means the entire premise you've built your waiting around, that action should follow readiness, may have the sequence exactly backward. This is the next realization, and it changes everything about how this pattern actually gets interrupted. Because if readiness is produced by action rather than a prerequisite for it, then waiting for the right moment isn't just delaying your goal. It is actively preventing the only mechanism that could ever produce the feeling you're waiting for. Viktor Frankl's insight becomes essential here, not as inspiration, but as precise psychological mechanism. Frankl's central discovery was that between stimulus and response, there exists a space, and within that space lies the entirety of human freedom. Most people experience their hesitation as automatic, as though the delay itself were simply a fact about the situation rather than a choice happening in real time. But the moment you can locate that gap, the split second between the impulse to wait and the automatic justification that follows it, you gain access to something you didn't have before. Not certainty, choice, and choice, exercised even once, begins to weaken a pattern that has otherwise run on autopilot for years. The Stoics understood a companion truth that speaks directly to what keeps so many people frozen in wait mode. Seneca wrote extensively about the particular danger of postponement, observing that people guard their material possessions carefully while spending their time, the one truly irreplaceable resource, with careless abandon, as though an infinite supply of it were still coming. This isn't a poetic observation. It's a precise diagnosis of a cognitive distortion behavioral psychologists still study today. The tendency to treat future time as more abundant and more favorable than present time, even though present time is the only time that has ever actually existed for any of us. Epictetus offered a complementary discipline, insisting that within any circumstance, however imperfect, a person retains control over their own judgment and action. The conditions were never going to become perfect. That was never actually the variable in question. The only variable that was ever truly available to you was whether you would act inside the conditions you already had. Marcus Aurelius. Ruling an empire under constant threat and uncertainty. Never once had the luxury of waiting for ideal conditions. And his private writings reveal a man who understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. That the obstacle itself very often becomes the way forward. Not despite the imperfection of the moment, but through it. There was no perfect moment for him either. There rarely is for anyone. The perfect moment is a story the mind tells to postpone or risk it. Hasn't yet learned it can survive. This is where evolutionary psychology offers a final, clarifying layer to this entire pattern, because human beings did not evolve to take unnecessary risks in stable conditions. For most of human history, caution was the survival optimal strategy, and a nervous system that hesitated before an uncertain action, one with no guaranteed payoff and a real possibility of loss, was often the nervous system that lived longest. This means the impulse to wait isn't a personal defect. It's an ancient survival mechanism, still running exactly as it was designed to. Except it was calibrated for a world of physical danger, not a world where the primary risk is social judgment, emotional disappointment, or the discomfort of uncertainty. Your biology is applying Paleolithic caution to a modern decision, and it does not know the difference. Understanding this doesn't mean the fear disappears. It means the fear finally makes sense. And fear that makes sense is far easier to act alongside than fear that feels like an unexplainable personal failing. Jung's model of individuation offers the final piece of this puzzle, because the goal was never to eliminate hesitation entirely, as if courage meant the complete absence of fear. Jung understood that psychological wholeness requires integrating the frightened part of the self rather than pretending it doesn't exist. This means the path forward isn't waiting until the fear disappears before acting. It is learning to act while the fear is still present, fully felt, fully acknowledged, and no longer given the final vote. This reframes the entire question this documentary opened with. The right moment you've been waiting for was never a future event with better conditions attached to it. It was never going to arrive fully formed, free of risk, free of uncertainty, free of the discomfort you've been trying to avoid. That moment, exactly as imperfect and uncertain as it currently is the only kind of moment that has ever existed for anyone who has ever done anything that mattered. None of this means the waiting has been your fault in some simple, blaming sense. It means the pattern finally has a name, an ancient nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. A private logic protecting an identity from a risk it was never actually strong enough to test. A mind mistaking preparation for progress because preparation feels safer than the real thing. Naming it doesn't dissolve it instantly, but it does mean that the next time the familiar, reasonable-sounding voice arrives, suggesting you wait just a little longer, you will recognize it for exactly what it is. So the next time you feel yourself reaching for one more reason to wait, pause long enough to ask yourself a harder question than whether the timing is right. Ask yourself who you would already be if you had stopped waiting for permission the first time this feeling showed up. If this kind of psychology, the kind that finally explains the moment you've been standing in front of for far too long, is what you come here for, subscribe, because there's more of this waiting for you.